Hi, I'm Laura Allen, Chief Curator and Curator of Japanese Art at the Asian Art Museum. Today I'd like to give you a tour of some of the oldest works in the museum's Japanese art collection. Right now we're in the Early Japan Gallery. It showcases prehistoric objects from Japan's remote past. They are arranged in roughly chronological order and span quite a long time period, from the 3rd millennium BCE to the 6th century CE. The works shown here come from a time well before the first written records. Most of what we know about these objects comes from careful archaeological excavations carried out over the last century. New discoveries are happening all the time, adding depth to our picture of the past. The materials found in this gallery are primarily clay and bronze, which, being durable, survive when textiles and wood have deteriorated. In particular, I'd like to focus on 3 early ceramic jars. Clay was used to make vessels in Japan as early as 14,500 BCE. The earliest pottery from Japan is considered the earliest in the world, and they're also an ancient link in a ceramic tradition that continues to the present day. Ever since the first hunter-gatherers, people have needed to store and serve food or to keep other important materials safe. But honestly, you might say, how interesting can a jar really be? What stories can they tell about the past? What can they tell us about social change and the movement of people and ideas? And what do their physical differences reveal about advances in technology? Let's take a closer look. The jar we're looking at right now is estimated to date between 3000 and 2000 BCE during Japan's Neolithic period. It was built up from coils of soft clay without the aid of a potter's wheel. If we could look inside, we'd see that the walls are relatively thick. Clay was mixed with other materials, such as crushed shells. And if you look very closely at the rim, you can see some of those shells. The color and the relatively rough surface tell us that it was fired at a low temperature, probably in some kind of pit fire like a big bonfire. The low firing temperature means that it's water permeable, so it's a place to store foods rather than keeping liquids. And you've probably noticed by now it's unglazed, but it's still pretty fancy. Someone really cared about its looks and took a lot of trouble to adorn it. There's a variety of 3-dimensional ornamentation here. Loop handles with a hole in the top of each handle. They rise in sculptural curls from the top of the rim, and the shape of the jar, with its columnar body and the swelling area below the rim, is actually kind of top-heavy. Maybe ropes went through the loops, helping to keep the jar upright or suspended. I don't really know that for sure, but it seems to make sense. The entire surface is covered with an intricate surface pattern of curving lines and stippling. It actually combines 3 distinct decorative techniques. First, you can see applique, thin ropes of clay attached to the surface, incised lines that are scraped into the surface with a piece of wood, bamboo, or shell. And the pattern of dots are actually markings from pieces of rope that have been pressed and rolled into the clay. In Japanese, the word jomon, or cord-marked, gives the name to the culture of this period. And there's a surprising variety to these patterns. Archaeologists have studied them, finding twisted, plaited, knotted ropes in dozens of distinctive patterns. The care that went into their adornment is one clue that they may have been used for ritual or ceremonial purposes. Excavations have unearthed small figurines from the same period called dogu, of which we have some fragmentary examples. They're also made of clay. They've been found in circumstances that suggest their use in rituals. And these objects give a picture of a society that was relatively settled, where clay was used not only for practical purposes, to contain food and other materials, but also for ceremonial objects, which were invested with qualities suitable for communicating with spirits. Ceramic forms became more varied in late Jomon, including more complex, decorated forms like this one, which was probably used as a censer. Openings in the top were to let out smoke or other fragrance. Before we leave this jar, let me show you one more interesting thing. If you look really, really carefully, you can see some differences in color, and those indicate that it has been reconstructed in modern times from a collection of small fragments. This is really common for objects this old. It's amazing anything has survived at all. I hope the next time you come to the museum, you can take a closer look. Jumping forward in time, let's move to this case. It holds ceramics from the Yayoi period, 300 BCE to 250 CE. You'll immediately notice that the aesthetic has changed. How about this beautiful shape? It has smoothly swelling sides, a narrow mouth that flares to a trumpet-like opening, and it's very functional, good for keeping grains safe from rodents and moisture. It's a nice, stable, solid form. And it's such a pleasing shape with qualities that remind us of nature's bounty. A body like a pear, a neck like an open flower. The physical differences between this jar and the one we looked at before highlight an important change in Japanese society. Between 1000 BCE and the 1st century CE, rice cultivation was introduced from the continent, along with ironworking and bronze casting technologies brought by immigrants. Populations became more settled as lifestyle shifted from being based on food gathering to an economy based on food production centering on rice. And there is, at the same time, less variety in ceramic forms, as shapes were made to suit the needs of an agricultural society. There were also some technical changes that subtly affect the appearance of these ceramics. Yayoi ceramics are still unglazed, but now the clay is finer and the surfaces are smoothed. The jars are still crafted by hand from coils or slabs of clay, but the walls are getting thinner, and they're fired at a somewhat higher temperature, making them more durable and somewhat lighter in color. Archaeologists believe that during the latter part of the Yayoi period, turntables were introduced. It's not yet a true potter's wheel. Instead, as the potter worked, the jar would be placed on a turntable and its surface was paddled smooth from the exterior. This process compacts the clay and results in a regular, symmetrical form. In contrast to the jomon jar, which was adorned with 3 distinct types of decoration, the ornamentation here is minimal, and the emphasis is on the form itself. Slight variations in coloring, this dark patch here, for instance, are accidental, not deliberate. The sole decoration is on the neck. You have to look really close to see it. There's a delicate sawtooth pattern incised there. This detail connects this jar to another Yayoi period object nearby in the gallery. This is a bell-shaped bronze, or dotaku, one of the great treasures of our collection. It stands more than 2 feet high. Though it's shaped like a bell, and its form was derived from bells made in Korea and China, the dotaku has no clapper, and its walls are too thin to sustain their use as instruments. Somewhat mysteriously, they're found buried in remote places in mountainsides. Often, as was the case for this dotaku, they were stacked one within another and then buried. Scholars theorize that the dotaku played a role in the ceremonial life of the Yayoi people, and that they were used during rituals to ensure good harvests or other ceremonies connected to agricultural life. If you look closely at the handle, along the edge of the handle, you'll see a sawtooth pattern almost identical to the one on the Yayoi jar. As with ceramics, decoration of the dotaku is usually confined to orderly, symmetrical arrangements of geometric designs. The jar and the dotaku share a common aesthetic, far less exuberant and more controlled than the ceramics produced in the mid to late Jomon period. The third jar in our tour is completely different. It's actually 5 jars in one. This one is from the period known as Kofun, which translates as ancient burial mound or tumulus. The main body of the jar is a pretty sphere raised on a flaring pedestal with geometric cutouts. The cutouts are not just decoration. They were made to promote even heat distribution during the firing process, preventing breakage or distortion. The jar has a neck shaped like a trumpet's horn, and a flat area at the rim indicates that there was once a lid. Other examples that preserve the lid show that our jar's lost lid was probably a flattened dome with a central knob. On the jar's shoulder are perched 4 miniature jars, and between them, 4 diminutive animal heads poke out, possibly deer. The color is also quite different than what we've seen before. It's dark gray instead of red. This new type of ware, known in Japanese as sueware, reflects the introduction of 2 new technological advancements. First, the potter's wheel. This complicated form was assembled from multiple shapes, most of them formed using a potter's wheel. The dark color has to do with the temperature at which it was fired and the conditions in the kiln during firing. Some of you might be familiar with the term stoneware. This is an early example. It was fired at a much higher temperature than the other 2 jars, allowing for greater fusion and hardening of the clay body. What made this new type of high-fired pottery possible? It was another new technology, a new type of kiln introduced from the Korean peninsula in the late 4th to early 5th century. The Onogama was made by digging holes in the slope of a hillside. So the fire rises from the bottom of the kiln up the slope and exits through a chimney at the top. The draft in this type of kiln ensures that the fire becomes really hot, above 1,000 degrees Celsius. And that heat actually fuses and hardens the clay, basically closing its pores and making it more durable. So stoneware represents a real advance in that it can hold liquids. Japan didn't have a culture of using bronze for vessels, although lacquered wood was abundant. By controlling the conditions in the kiln, for example, adding plant materials toward the end of firing, potters were able to take oxygen out of the atmosphere. The smoky atmosphere deposits carbon on the clay, darkening the minerals in the body, sealing its pores, and changing its texture, resulting in a smooth, hard surface of a dark gray or charcoal white color. By the way, this material is similar to the gray pottery used to make roof tiles in Japan, even today. One more thing. Looking closely at the side, you can see traces of natural ash glaze. In this high-temperature atmosphere inside the Onogama kiln, wood ash from the fire melts. Pulled up in the fire's draft, the ash lands on the surface of a vessel and will fuse, forming a glassy greenish surface. Here you see rivulets going down the side. Here it's an accidental effect, but later potters make deliberate use of ash to create glazes. Both the shape and the firing method used bear a close relationship to Korean prototypes. For example, gray stoneware from Three Kingdoms, Korea, like this jar on view now in our Korean art galleries. This kind of relatively ornate, elaborate shape would have been reserved for the elite. In a case nearby are other kinds of objects found in tombs of this period, such as bronze mirrors and weapons, many of them imported from China, that functioned as symbols of political authority. The best-known tombs of this age were enormous keyhole-shaped tombs found from the 3rd century on. The tombs were topped with another kind of ceramic object, figures, animals, houses, cylinders, and ceremonial objects like shields, some several feet tall, known as haniwa. The haniwa are low-fired and made of clay rings like the earliest pottery. These fascinating figures are detailed to reflect a range of individuals in different social roles and statuses, from humble farmers to shamanesses to warriors and rulers themselves. We don't have time to look closely at them today, but I hope you'll come back to the museum sometime soon and spend more time in this gallery. Of course, the Asian Art Museum also has a large collection of Japanese ceramics, not only these early wares, but many amazing later vessels and spectacular sculptural ceramics by contemporary clay artists. The next time you take a sip of tea or coffee from a porcelain cup, or put flowers in a vase of clay, please pause to remember these ancient traces of the past and their links to the achievements of the present day.